Okay, so last week we were in John chapter 19, and we did verses 1 through 15. And
Where are we?
we're in John,
Yeah,
the Gospel of John chapter 19,
yeah.
and we're starting with verse 16.
Oh, verse 16.
But last week we ended with John 15. And when Pilate said to the Jewish leaders, "Behold your king," they cried out, this is verse 15, "Away with him, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said unto them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." And what I wanted to tell you about that is that God's people did that to God before. And this is in 1 Samuel 8. And it talks about Samuel's sons were put in place of Samuel, but they were like bad guys. They were taking bribes and perverting justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered themselves together and came to Samuel unto Ramah and said unto him, "Behold, you are old, and your sons don't walk in your ways. Now make us a king to judge us like all the other nations." See, they weren't happy to have God as their judge and king. They wanted a man. They wanted to be like the other nations. But the thing displeased Samuel, and they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed unto the Lord. And the Lord said unto Samuel, "Listen unto the voice of the people in all that they're saying to you. For they have not rejected you, Samuel. They have rejected me, God, that I should not reign over them." So they don't want God to reign over them back there. They would rather have a man. And the same thing is happening here. They said, "Well, we want Caesar." They didn't want Jesus, the King of the Jews, to reign over them, who was actually God in the flesh. They wanted a man. They said, "Caesar's our God." So they were doing the same thing. Verse 16, "Then delivered he him therefore unto them," that's the soldiers, "to be crucified. And they took Jesus and led him away. And he, bearing his cross, went forth into a place called the place of a skull, which is called in the Hebrew language Golgotha. In the Latin, which when Luke writes about this, because he's a Greek and he uses the Latin, he calls it Calvary. But Golgotha, Calvary, they both mean the place of a skull. And they could be calling it that because so many people were crucified there. It was like, a skull, a place of death. Or it could be that there was an outcropping of stone that kind of resembled a skull. So nobody knows that for sure. Well, Christ was carrying that cross. When you think about it, he had the flesh literally ripped off of his back, right, when they did the scourging. And now they're laying a cross on his back, and he's already bled out so much, he collapsed. He collapsed under that. And in Matthew 27:32, it says, "A man of Cyrene, Simon by name, him they compelled to bear his cross." So God provided this man, and what a lucky man to be able to carry that burden for Christ. And then verse 18, "Where they crucified him, and two others with him, on either side, and Jesus in the midst." In Isaiah 53:12, it says, "He was numbered with the transgressors." So this was also another fulfillment of prophecy. There were so many fulfillments of prophecy during this trial, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. Okay, verse 19. "And Pilate wrote a title and put it on the cross. And the writing was, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. This title Then read many of the Jews, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. And it was written in Hebrew because that was their religious language, and a lot of Jews spoke Hebrew. Matthew even wrote his gospel in Hebrew. And then it was in Greek because that was the language of the culture. If there were any other people visiting at that time, all the strangers would know Greek. And then Latin was the official language. So the reason why he put this on the cross, it was his accusation. And Pilate was afraid that somehow it would get back to Rome, that he crucified an innocent man, and his job would be in jeopardy. So he put a public notice up there with the accusation of what he was, King of the Jews, which would have been sedition, that he was trying to take over, which he wasn't. But there were so many people that day, because when it says a lot of people read the sign, because you got to remember, Christ was crucified on Passover. And the Passover feast included Passover, that's the day that he's crucified. And then the next day is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And then the following Sunday is the Feast of First Fruits, which is the day that Jesus rose from the dead. But all that together, they call that whole feast Passover. So there were Jews from everywhere. This town was packed with people. So Pilate wanted to make sure that everybody knew that he was doing something legitimate, even though he knew Christ was innocent. Verse 21, then said the chief priest of the Jews to Pilate, write not the King of the Jews, but that he said, I am the King of the Jews. Now, haven't they really done enough? Think about it. They got an innocent man, they put him in their courts and lied about it and accused him. They threatened Pilate, if he wouldn't crucify Jesus, that they were going to tell Caesar. So it was extortion. Okay, so they're doing all that. Like, that isn't enough. They're getting him crucified. Now they're worried about the title that is on his cross. These people are like power crazy. They want to change that too. Well, in verse 22, Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. So he's saying, this conversation is over. Because he had to have it on there that he was the King of the Jews. Otherwise, the crucifixion wouldn't be legitimate. And he, at this point, doesn't care what these chief priests are saying. John 19, verse 23. Then the soldiers, when they had crucified Jesus, took his garments and made 4 parts, to every soldier a part. So when you think about that, for every soldier a part, it looks like there were 4 soldiers. They didn't need the whole band anymore just to crucify him and the 2 thieves. So, and also his garment, his coat. Now the coat was without seam, woven from the top throughout. They said, therefore, among themselves, let's don't tear it, but we'll cast lots for it, whose it shall be, that the scripture might be fulfilled, which said, they parted my raiment among them, and for my vesture they cast lots. These things, therefore, did the soldiers. Now, what's very interesting about that, his outer garment didn't have a seam.
That's weird.
It is. I don't know how anyone could do that. They started at the top or they started at a sleeve. I don't know how they did it, but that must have been somebody who really cared about him who made that.
Very expensive in those days.
Yeah, well, I think it was made for him. It would have been like maybe his mother.
Yeah.
What's crazy is that these soldiers are doing all this and they don't even know that they're fulfilling prophecy.
Wow.
They think, well, maybe they do this for any prisoner who's going to be crucified and they're the ones who are chosen to do it. Oh, well, because they strip them naked.
Wow.
They don't wear anything when they're crucified.
They don't?
No, the pictures always are painted with something, but no, you're stripped naked. It's part of the humiliation.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah. So they were probably used to doing this to, dividing up the clothes or whatever, they could get off of these people. But I wanted to read Psalm 22 because it talks about this. In verse 22:18, it says, "They part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture."
Wow.
So this was all predicted that this was going to
It
happen.
was years before.
Oh yeah, David wrote that. Then verse 25, "Now there stood by the cross of Jesus his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Cleophas and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus therefore saw his mother and the disciple standing by, whom he loved," that would have been this disciple, John, "he said unto his mother, Woman, behold thy son. And he said to the disciple, Behold thy mother. And from that hour, that disciple took her unto his home from that day on." And what's amazing about this is that, that's part of the law, honor your father and mother. And here he is dying on the cross, and he's concerned about his mother's welfare. That's how well he kept the law. But here's the thing that's interesting. Jesus had brothers. Mary had other sons. She had James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. Well, then why would Jesus have to put his mother in the care of the Apostle John? It's because his brothers rejected him during his life. Now, his brother James ends up writing the book of James. His brother Judas ends up writing the book of Jude. But at this point in time, they had completely rejected him. Okay, now I'm going to read a little bit more Psalm 22. It's just that this tells so much of what happened on the cross. This is Psalm 22:14. "I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint." See, they're out of joint from being on the cross and being pulled out of joint. "My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels." That means it's just melted within me. "My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws. And you have brought me into the dust of the earth. The dogs have compassed around me." Those are those Pharisees. Yeah. "The assembly of the wicked have enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet."
Wow.
Think about this being written so many years before it happened. "I may tell all my bones. They look and stare upon me, and they part my garments among them and cast lots upon my vesture." So all this was prophecy fulfilled. But there are some parts that are not in John. So I'm going to read a little bit from Mark 15:29 through 33. "And the scripture was fulfilled which said, And he was numbered with the transgressors. And they that passed railed on him, wagging their heads and saying, Ah, thou that destroyed the temple and builded it in 3 days, save thyself, and come down from the cross. Likewise also the chief priests, mocking, said among themselves with the scribes, He saved others. Himself he cannot save. Let Christ, the King of Israel, descend now from the cross, that we may see and believe," like they really wanted to believe. "And they that were crucified with him reviled him." So everybody who was there, except for those women and John, were completely ridiculing him, even the two that were crucified with him. "And when the 6th hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. Now, this darkness, this time of darkness, was when God was putting the sins of the world onto Christ. He suffered every disease that anyone would ever have. He was punished, actually literally punished by God. The crucifixion wasn't just his punishment. God punished him, gave him the punishment that we deserve for our sin. He punished him during that darkness. So back to John, this is verse 28. After this, Jesus, knowing that all things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, he said, I thirst. Now there was set a vessel full of sour wine, and they filled a sponge with vinegar and put it on hyssop and put it to his mouth. When Jesus therefore had received the vinegar, he said, it is finished. That means everything he came to do on earth, he fulfilled it. It was over. And here's something very interesting. Before he gave up the ghost, it says he bowed his head. It's like he's bowing before God. And then he gave up the ghost. But when he said it is finished, in Matthew, I'm going to read a little bit about what it says about that incident in Matthew. It says he yelled it because he was yelling it as victory over sin and death and Satan. That's what he accomplished on the cross for us. He paid the price of death and got victory over death. And that's why he rose from the grave, because he had victory over death. But in Matthew 27, 50 through 54, it says, when Jesus had cried again with a loud voice, he yielded up the ghost. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from the top to the bottom. You know, go ahead.
From the top to the bottom.
Yeah, so this wasn't an accident. And it just happened to so be at the time when the priest would be going in to make prayers. So a priest would have been there and seen this ripped apart. And you know what the significance of that is? Okay? Only the priest could go behind that veil once a year on the Day of Atonement with a blood sacrifice, because that was where the Ark of the Covenant was, and he would sprinkle the blood. Well, when Jesus died, God ripped that veil in two, because you know what? We don't need a priest anymore. We go right in to the Holy of Holies, to the throne of God, and we can speak to him. One-on-one. We don't need a priest to do that. And that's the significance of that veil being torn at his death. And then verse 51, and behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, meaning there was an earthquake at this time, at his death. And the rocks were split. And the graves were open, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose and came out of the graves.
They came out alive.
Yes. This says after his resurrection, this happened, that they came out of the grave. And went into the holy city and appeared unto many. So when Jesus rises from the dead, a whole bunch of people rise from the dead, but only saints. Not sinners, saints. And it was like, I don't know if that when Christ rose from the dead, there was so much power in the ground that it went out. I can't explain that, how it happened. But these people, it shows God's power over death. They all came out of their graves and they went into the holy city. And remember, this was a feast. So there would have been a lot of people there. They're going, hey, I remember, my mom's back.
Oh my God.
You know? It would have been such an incredible testimony. However, these people died again. They weren't resurrected like Jesus was, because when Jesus was resurrected, never to die again. And when we get our resurrection bodies, we will never die again. Yes.
So these people that arose, they lived on.
They lived till they Died a natural death again. Just like Lazarus did.
Yeah.
Lazarus was raised from the dead, but he didn't live forever. And the other people, he died a natural death eventually. And the other people who Jesus raised from the dead. And then verse 54. Now when the centurion and they that were with him watching Jesus saw the earthquake and those things that were done, they feared greatly, saying, truly, this was the Son of God.
How they must have felt.
Yes, but what's another thing that John doesn't talk about is that the one thief on the cross ended up realizing as well that this was the Son of God and said, remember me. And Jesus said, today I will be with you in paradise. Yeah, so there were people that even got faith during the crucifixion. So that's my lesson for tonight.